This is Norman Kissinger from Redeeming the Time Brothers Ministries, coming to you again from the beautiful state of Missouri. And I would like to continue with our talk on George Muller and his life. And as I've been reading through this book, I come across just some wonderful thoughts and things that the Lord kind of speaks to my heart about. And one of them is that George Muller followed a very specific process when he tried to figure out if something was God's will or not. So the first thing that he did was that he would go before God and make sure that his heart was right. And he was very careful about that to make sure that he was, in a sense, ruthless on himself. He was very hard on himself to make sure that there wasn't any kind of hidden sin in his life or hidden motive or wrong motive in what he was doing. And that's kind of opposite of today, because I think in today's culture, even in the Christian culture, there's a lot of a push to basically make everybody okay. And the truth of the matter is, our flesh is not okay, and it is very deceptive, and we can very often believe that we're in a right relationship with God, feel like we're right with God, but maybe have things in our hearts or whatever that are displeasing to Him. And if you went back into the early 1900s, the 1800s, you would find that the saints of those days and before then were very suspicious of themselves. They were very suspicious of their motives. They were very suspicious that when things seemed like they were okay or right, that they weren't necessarily okay or right. And I think that's a good approach to take in life, that we got to be careful that we're truly seeking God and we're truly being honest with ourselves about our own motives and why we want something to happen. Number two, George Muller would then go before God, sometimes for months, something that a guy named Andrew Murray, which also wrote books in that same time frame. I've been listening to a book from him, and Andrew Murray talked about this idea of waiting upon God. Now, I'm still learning that concept, or at least what they mean by that concept. But as applied in George Muller's life, what it basically meant was that George Muller did not move ahead on anything until he was 100% sure it was God's will. And he would keep seeking the Lord until he knew for sure it was God's will. And if he had to wait until he was convinced it was God's will, he would continue to wait until he found God's will in a matter, so that he could have the assurance that when he prayed by faith for God to do something, that he was going to do it. Not might do it, not kind of sort of would do it, but he was for sure going to do it. And so that is so different than what a lot of the kind of our modern prayers we have. I mean, our modern prayer, prayer is very helpful for healing the heart. Prayer is very helpful for encouraging me personally. But prayer is also meant to have prayers answered, and for God to save souls and heal people and supply needs and advance His kingdom. And so one of the ways that in order to have answered prayer and the faith from answered prayer is that we have to be 100% sure that whatever we're praying about is something that is God's will. And he, of course, is the master at understanding this in church history, or one of the masters of understanding this subject. And I certainly is something that I have learned throughout my lifetime a little bit, but he's just amazing at it, what he would do, until he was for sure that something was the will of the Lord. And where he would go to look for that, of course, was the scriptures. First off, was it biblical? And he would study scriptures on the subject until he found verses that convinced him that it was something that was God's will that he wanted to accomplish. And then after that, he would go before God and he would pray persistently, as the parable says, and he would pray consistently and with intensity, and he would then expect God to meet the needs. Now, I noticed in the book that there were times, and I was just reading through a time where, in the chapter before, that literally they would go up until the moment and not have the need met. Literally, right up until the time that the example of a food cart that broke down, that had food in it, that the food driver had to give away to the orphanage because it was going to spoil anyway. Or just people sending money at the very last second And remember that he was very, very adamant about this, never asked anybody or told anybody besides the inner circle that was praying about things what their needs were. So if $5 came in because they needed $5, or £5 came in because they needed £5, it came in because God supplied it. And so sometimes then in the early days, they would pray and wait up until the last second. But as George Muller's faith grew, there were times as he went along that he would pray over huge projects that would cost thousands of pounds to build more orphanages, and God would begin to supply the money without him asking. And when the project was done, he might even have money left over. And so I thought about that and thought that often we'll kind of go back and forth with the Lord, that sometimes he supplies right away, sometimes he waits, sometimes he gives more than enough, sometimes he gives just enough. But regardless, when we follow the principles of prayer, God makes the promise that he's going to answer in such a way that we'll know for sure that he's there. One of the reasons that I know God is there is because of the times that he has specifically answered prayers in my life that only he could have known and only he could have did it. And that's one of the reasons that Christians, we need to learn to be prayer warriors so that we can understand those concepts and be able to encourage other people in those. This is Norman Kissinger from Redeeming the Time Brothers Ministry. God bless you. You have a great weekend.